Before continuing, I'd like to take a moment to recognize that the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their land by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. And they continue to make important contributions to many communities and institutions, including the University of Oregon, the state of Oregon, the United States, and to the world. In acknowledging the original people of the land we occupy, we extend our respect to the indigenous people of Oregon and all other displaced indigenous people who call Oregon home. With today's conversation and our collective activity, we recognize Oregon's first people as the past, present, and future stewards of this land. And we pledge our commitment to make ongoing efforts to center indigenous existence in the work we do. I'd also like to extend this commitment to the people who may not have directly been impacted by settler colonialism on sites currently inhabited by the University of Oregon, yet have been systematically oppressed, denied access, and physically and psychologically abused for generations by the very structures and mechanisms that have afforded the University of Oregon and so many of our students, staff, and faculty opportunities to thrive. As such, we pledge continued commitment to support and make ongoing efforts to center the best interests of all BIPOC individuals and communities in our work. While I fully believe in the practice of acknowledging the land we occupy as agents of this institution, I'm increasingly uncomfortable with the ways this may allow institutions to less urgently address historic issues caused by colonialism that are still present in the lived experience of individuals and communities. I'm heartened by recent news about the University of Oregon's Home Flight Scholars Program, which resources indigenous students with tuition support, among other things, and want to call attention to the responsibility those of us who benefit from the relationship to the University of Oregon have to continue to work beyond acknowledgments, to agitate for support that serves people on their terms. Additionally, by acknowledging the land we occupy, I'd also like to propose a form of collective gratitude for the ability to be here today on this land in the relative safety of this building, which benefits from a great deal of resources and freedoms that have allowed us the privilege to assemble under the auspices of intellectual exchange and inquiry. The Ford Family Foundation's Visual Arts Program honors the foundation's late co-founder, Haley Ford, and her lifelong interest in the arts by helping Oregon's most promising visual artists actively pursue their work. One element of that program is Critical Conversations, a collaboration between the foundation and the University of Oregon in partnership with Pacific Northwest College of Art at Willamette University, Portland State University, and Reed College. Critical Conversations is a nexus space for the work of artists and cultural producers that manifests as fertile medium through which exchange, collaboration, and new forms of inquiry are catalyzed. Organizing partners facilitate a year-round calendar of studio visits for Oregon artists by 3 prominent visiting curators or critics. We host related public lectures and other forms of engagement with these visitors, and oversee a series of convenings that engage community participants around currents in society in the field. In addition to events like today's, engagement is made accessible to a broader audience through a variety of platforms, including Critical Conversations annual publication, for which we gather content from a range of activities and commission writings around theme. We launched this project in 2021 with an inaugural publication dedicated to the notion of figuring, and have recently distributed our second edition focused on conditions. In addition to today's talk and studio visits with Oregon artists and cultural producers this week, Natasha will also contribute a written piece to a future publication. This program is such a gift to artists and cultural producers in the state of Oregon, and I am so grateful to Critical Conversations founder Kate Wagley UO Professor Emeritus and the Ford Family Foundation's former Senior Advisor for the Visual Arts Program, Candace Brewer-Nunn, for initiating, sustaining, and expanding the program over the last 13 years to become what it is today. In addition to Candace and Kate, I also want to acknowledge and thank the people who represent our partner institutions and who together have brought the state of Oregon such an exceptional group of visionary curators and critics. Thank you to Stephanie Snyder, Director and Curator of the Cooley Gallery at Reed College, Shauna Lipton, Associate Professor and Chair of the MA in Critical Studies at PNCA, Mariana Ramirez, the Director of the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at Portland State University, and especially to Megan Attia, the Senior Advisor for the Ford Family Foundation's Visual Arts Program, for her boundless partnership and support. I'd also like to give a big thanks to Laura Butler Hughes, Critical Conversations Program Coordinator, for her essential help with more things than we have time to mention here. Additionally, I'd like to acknowledge the contributions made by my colleagues in the Department of Art and Center for Art Research Director Colin Ives and CFAR Program Manager Wendy Heldman, and former CFAR board members Tanaz Farsi and Rick Silva, as well as the unyielding support of our department head, Anya Kavarkis, school director, Laura Vandenberg, and the dean of the College of Design, Adrian Parr. The opportunities to invite people here through programs like Critical Conversations are truly invaluable, as these occasions are chances for us to take stock of who we are and what our priorities may be, what currents in the world relate to the work we do, and what issues need further consideration. Natasha Ginwala's work has a fundamental relationship to the collective goals of our community, and at this time feels critical to the work we're doing. With curatorial and writing practices concerned with political and cultural issues of the Global South, Natasha's accomplishments are wide-ranging and plenty, including large-scale curatorial projects such as the 2021 Gwangju Biennale, a collaboration with Defne Ayas, and her work on the curatorial team for Documenta 14. Natasha also writes regularly on contemporary art and visual culture and recently edited Stronger Than Bone, published by Archive Books, and Knights of the Dispossessed, Riots Unbound, published by Columbia Press. After I've taken 9 hours to introduce Natasha, in the interest of not rambling too much about what the internet may be able to present better than me, I'll forgo the typical list of propers that happens in introductions like this, and just say that I'm incredibly grateful to be here and welcome you here, and hope that you all will join me in welcoming Natasha.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Brian and Laura, for welcoming me and for plotting all of the logistics that it has taken to get me to arrive here safely and to be with all of you in the community at University of Oregon. The Critical Conversation series is a striking and thoughtful engagement with contemporary cultural practices, which I appreciate adding my voice to and be part of this joint intention. And in the spirit of conversation, I've invited scholar, artist, DJ, and writer Hiba Ali to join me in this practice-led endeavor, so that it is not just a lecture, but really a thinking out loud, also sonically, and inhabiting a space of experiment that we have actually been waiting for. And so, with that, we'll talk more about it, but I just want to place in the room that there's often many of us, we have to wait for opportunities like this to meet each other. And sometimes that's a painful, thing, but sometimes it's also a joyous thing when it finally happens, because there are so many forces that pull us apart, geopolitically, socially, And so when this kind of conviviality can be expressed within the academy, we grab it. Between Waves and Sea Change is a rubric that enables me to present to you some of my ongoing work over the past years. And most of it is in collaboration, so some people have been named already, but I would just address that it is emergent from a sort of network of exchange. And these are not only collaborators, but co-voyagers. I've been immersed in addressing cultural resonances from and into the Indian Ocean or the Afrasian Sea in different velocities over recent years. As part of my makeup, Gujarat in Western India, where I'm from, has been one of the oldest points of crossings, whether that is into the Persian Gulf, into the Horn of Africa, and across Southeast Asia. Rather than, however, major historic mercantile events, it is the smaller stories as a form of archipelagic thinking that we remain attuned toward. And so I also hold, this particular artwork by Mahen Pereira, a Sri Lankan artist I work with, this kind of fragile ensemble that brings organic and inorganic materiality together. That is emergent from that ocean, but that is also undoing our expectations of what the Anthropocene means, what it means to actually be part of an exacerbated an extremely precarious time in the world today. Renisa Mavani and Dilip Menon, among others, have referred to such a praxis as I will endeavor to put forward today in terms of ocean as method, citing from hydraulic memory that is often transmitted through the body, lived experience, oral histories, that reckons with the foamy surface of indigo waters just as much as with the undercurrents, through encountering and studying legacies of captivity, indenture, and immobility, but also the accounts of free agents who have navigated this ocean before colonial maritime law segmented the waters, piracy that challenges imperial powers, and formations of cosmopolitan membership in ancient port towns. So there are, on the one hand, convenient categorizations that serve global capital and trade flows, which have bred distinctions between the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Ocean waters. But also there is academia that has played a role in building a certain terrain of scholarship, often stifling, often limited, around the Atlantic Ocean. So this is a sort of attempt to broaden the lens so that we find the movements of the Indian Ocean world that have birthed peoples and cultures that foreground varied African and Asian diasporic worlds that remain buoyed in indigenous, Asian, Black, and Muslim seafaring technologies and cultural infrastructures that perform the role of counter-cartography. There appears to be an overdetermined, though gracious use of the term diversity within the domain of Euro-American institutional politics. So I just want to foreground with a quote how we might critically assess this tendency, because it doesn't always lend to an actual interweaving of reparation, unlearning, and communality in the dissemination of cultural knowledge. So I tried to unlearn with this quote by Edouard Glissant, who expresses diversity, which is neither chaos nor sterility, means the human spirit's striving for a cross-cultural relationship without universalist transcendence. Diversity needs the presence of peoples, no longer as objects to be swallowed up, but with the intention of creating a new relationship. Sameness requires fixed being, diversity establishes becoming. This installation, Earth Flags, made by Sri Lankan artist Mohanad Kader, reminds me of Glissant's understanding of diversity as a way of recognizing and building relationships, in this case with the horizon itself, as chronicled from 4 directions of Sri Lanka as an island nation that has witnessed long-drawn colonial legacies, ethnic violence, and civil war. When one shifts vantage points to observe the ocean from here, which is one of the places I live and work from, the artist's response is a reminder of how seascapes are the entities that are terraforming Earth. That while negotiating cultural and religious difference, we are also prone to developmental economics of new port infrastructures and extractivism. The artist has engaged with constructions of statehood and territoriality by questioning the ways in which landscapes become active agents in socio-political frameworks. Rendering these works to the scale of the international dimension of national flags, the artist nods to colonial border making and the sea land resources that are made into units of sovereign power. This is one among several works which is featured in an independent arts festival that I direct and work on with my partner and friends in Sri Lanka, called Colomboscope, and it's also a platform that is very, very precarious, but also something that for me marks a way of working in one sense within larger institutional frameworks, but then also a sense of circulation within one's own economy of means and affect to do nonprofit work within the context of Sri Lanka. The edition that we realized in 2019, Sea Change, addresses the urgencies of a rapidly altering coastline and the complex negotiations to be carried forward between islander communities, unfulfilled agendas of a planetary coexistence, and capitalist ambition that takes over in the wake of war. Sea Change evokes stories of maritime history, but also delves into oceanic ecology and shipping infrastructure. When we go back to ancient Lanka's strategic place in the Indian Ocean trade network, it gives shape to a cosmopolitan lineage of social pluralism and cultures of connectedness, linking distant ports of call from Rome in the west to China in the east, waters from the Bay of Bengal to the Mozambique Channel. How may we reimagine the Indian Ocean world today, not simply in extractive terms of economic growth, but instead as a realm of cultural affinities and a confluence of languages that treat it as a vital artistic meeting place. It is also the place that, when conditions allow, South Asian cultural producers can meet one another and negotiate their presence in an otherwise globalized and exclusionary art world. Derek Walcott's poem Sea is History from 1978 notes, "But the ocean kept turning blank pages looking for history." It was through this fragment of poetry that we commenced addressing maritime legacy and infrastructural histories of the sea, realizing this edition through times of political upheaval that included a coup, where life came to an eerie standstill, and this was prior to pandemic, so now there's other issues. We inaugurated the year with this festival that was attempting to still address open futures of the island and build interconnections within the coastline, while knowing that geopolitical powers were constantly trying to extract from its surface. Another work that we presented that is an example of this sort of concern with infrastructure and coloniality is a film installation called Sunstone by artists Philippa Cesar and Louis Henderson. These are just some snapshots from the film. which traces lighthouse infrastructures and places attention to the Fresnel lens, which is the key component that emits that enables this to be a navigation technology. And it is from this sort of site of production of the Fresnel lens in factories in Germany that are becoming obsolete, lighthouse museums, that they sort of gradually plot this quite complex cinematic form. They move from photosensitive celluloid to desktop images and 3D CGI to mark the story of a lighthouse keeper who is caught between colonial time, and also think about the ways in which his destiny is connected to the invention of global navigation satellite systems. So the tool that announces the form of the lighthouse that is still attempting to shed so-called light and direction into the dark waters announces itself its own sort of death. Registering these technical advances progressively through the film's materials and means of production, Sunstone creates a cinema of affect and refraction. And I'm interested in this notion of refraction because we talk a lot about opacity, but refraction is a mode of rupture that allows a breaking away from the darkness of captive dread and imperial logic. It spreads as contagion in nautical histories. Because as we know, the lighthouse as a technological architecture has been fundamental to projects of imperial expansion. Its prismatic throw of light, guiding passage by sea, charting the terrain of coastal histories, and Enlightenment philosophy are conjoined projects. So these artist filmmakers are interested in the shadow zones of what lies beyond the glow of this mercantile military apparatus along shorelines. That is, the optics of colonial modernity itself, and to cast a media archaeology of connectivity that is based on the terror of transparency, on exposing lives of those oppressed, of those traveling in those very waters. We travel from the lighthouse into another space. That is the space of shipbreaking. This again is a space which is not often talked about because museums that typically show naval infrastructure are so busy still exhibiting these large ships and these drawings and sort of showing the triumphant side of what navigation technologies have done, particularly from the sort of imperial imagination. But what lands on the shores in our parts of the world, in fact, is the ships that go to die. The ships that need to be broken down to their various parts and then become part of an industry of recycling, an industry of toxicity. So I also wanted to kind of bring that to attention because what we see in the work of Ranjit Kandalgaonkar, who has been doing this phenomenal work in his long-term project, Model Recycle Systems, is the way that shipbreaking itself is a circuit that we can plot is happening in various parts of South Asia. One of the biggest shipbreaking yards is in Gujarat, in Alang, where I'm from, and I happen to know what it's like. Also, the kind of economies that are generated within this point of the ships coming to this particular shipbreaking yard that have been rejected by countries such as France and so forth because of their inherent toxicity. They don't want to get their hands into these vessels. They want to send them away. And so what does it mean to sort of receive these gigantic vessels at the end of their life cycle on sea? So that's the kind of plotting that is being done within this project by Ranjit, and the shipwreck dossier is something that he presented within the Colomboscope Festival. And since then, we have also been thinking furthermore about what it means to create a counter cartography for the ship by in fact observing its constituent parts, by observing how it is raw material, and at the same time what other markets are composed when it actually comes to these shipbreaking yards, who lives off it, who are the migrants who end up working to perform this labor to break the ship down. Another work is this incredible set of drawings. I only show you one in detail, but it's a series by Jasmine Nelani Joseph, who is an artist based in northern Sri Lanka. And her work is performing another kind of mapping, which is commencing from field research and documenting from communal memory. Because what she's doing is dwelling on the ways in which this part of the island has been prone to displacement and to security infrastructures that denote militarization of the domestic sphere, but also of the natural world. In this case, the artist's biography plays out in several of her works as she accounts for fleeing violence and wartime. Those who are relations and relatives, the Sri Lankan diaspora is enormous, and there are obviously extremely traumatic reasons for this. And so the Indian Ocean, in a sense, on one hand plots this sort of imaginary that constructs an idea of Tamil confluence, of shared confluence from this point of the southern tip of India to this island that is the south of South Asia. It connects to Malay formations of identity. It connects to Arabic Tamil formations and identity. But at the same time, there is also the unraveling story of the kind of trauma of exodus and resettlement, of language barriers and cultural differences that play out in some of these stories that are plotted in the drawing practice of Jasmine Nelani Joseph. So one of the recurring questions really is that how to connect two maritime pasts that enable an idea of regional confluences and differential forms of geographic connectedness, but then knowing that the colonial enterprise and the ethnocratic nation are still alive and well, how might we then create these kinds of subjective experiences coming into being to be shared with publics that often don't find their place. These also allow a different kind of vast way in which one can share from what is really happening on the ground. And so you don't see these large shipping vessels that we talked about, in the previous practice. You see these boats, which are far smaller vessels. Dhows, for instance, as some of you may know, have sailed the Indian Ocean. So these do not have that majestic presence. They have another kind of way of really emerging from this ecology that is one that is marked by precarity and often with fatal consequences. From there, we go to the wetland. Mangrove ecologies are another subject that I've been looking at for quite a while because I'm interested in how these wetlands are in between spaces and how they become amphibious support structures that recultivate our relationship to the ocean within rural and urban contexts. This again is a work that was shown in the same edition of the festival. But here is a video that is made by dance artist Amara Rahim, who reflects on her multiple belongings between Sri Lanka and Australia in this 2-channel video that was made in a wetland in Werribee in Australia. She explores on one hand how her body inhabits the wetland, refusing the gaze of the camera and instead pretty much going face down into the space of the wetland, but also through that attuning to the flight pathways of migratory birds. Her gestures are inspired by the mangrove that forms a network of sensory antennas between land and water, as well as the bird's behavioral cycles and instinctive navigational capacities. Here, the human bird body is finding itself opening up in porous ways to its own migratory tugs, fluttering, nesting, and hovering. I'm going to speak about a lot of artists, so that's just how it goes. The project shifts, but the kind of artistic engagement is quite shared. So now we are moving into a more recent project, which is called Indigo, Waves and Other Stories. And so in a sense, we've moved away from this sort of non-profit work that for me has been happening from Sri Lanka into a collaborative project that is very current. So this exhibition actually is ongoing. It's on view at Zeitz MOCAA in Cape Town. It opened in July, and it will travel to Berlin. This is a project that I'm doing with Bonaventure Bejeng Ndikung and Michelangelo Corsaro as co-curators. Fahad Bishara calls forth sensorial registers such as the scent of teak meeting seawater, while remarking how the Indian Ocean Thou invited littoral societies to look out across the water to one another. As we transmit the knowledge that is harbored within many of us as water beings, Indigo, Waves and Other Stories seeks to set up reciprocal motions that unsettle established relations of area studies and socio-political polarities. Instead, it invites a reconsideration to notions of diaspora and cultural belonging in what might be called, let's leave aside Indian Ocean, let's think of it as Swahili Sea, Ratnakara, Bahari Hindi, the Afrasian Sea, this communal horizon from which we may read undercurrents of historiography and storylines of itinerant communities, their forced and unforced movements that have created a setting adrift through the voracity of empire. Neville Chitwick, in the 1974 conference in Mauritius, said, arguably, this ocean is the largest cultural continuum in the world. What might it mean then to continue working in this way, to decenter from heroic chronicles of mercantile exploration, to plot the encounters of sociality and exchange between living cultures? Because as T.N. Harper posits, the globalization of European imperialism was an extension of the nation state, but the globalism of diasporas was not. This is a work by Malala Andriala Vidrazana's series. It's a photo montage series called Figures that she has been doing since 2015. And it is reflecting on the problematics of cartography, as is quite evident, the violence and finiteness of maps that are assigned. Together we were thinking, in response to Malala's work, of a poem by Lee Maracle, who aptly says, "Maps are pretentious arrogantly purporting to know where everything is, pretending power where none is. Maps are finite, maps are always old. And I love this line of maps are always old, so the sense of outdatedness that we can assign to them rather than becoming oppressed by what they have to tell us. And so figures is a sort of exhumation and recomposition at not only a pictorial way, but also at a representational, in a representational way, because it is not only looking at territory, but is in fact animating that space of territory by deviating from it and looking into the movement of people, looking into systems of privilege, looking at cable networks and river systems, looking at bridges. And so each map really is a life world in itself that is endeavoring to find a collective truth that allows for a placemaking that is in opposition to the nation state's boundaries. In correspondence with it, and this is just a detail, so you don't see much, but just to mention as well how for us this project is very important to locate in a site responsive manner. So it's not like a sort of a UFO landing. We created this dialogue as well between Malala's figures and the work that is to my left, which is by a South African photographer and researcher called Luvuyo Ekweyani-Nyawoze, and his series Ebish. And Ebish is a photographic and archival project that has been thinking about access to beaches, and especially when we think about the fact of access to the water in apartheid South Africa. There are many stories that emerge that prevent the kind of sociality and black leisure that may be taken for granted today in other parts of the world. So this consciousness as well on how to archive absence, how to think about pleasure within water, knowing its sacred potential, how to think about the violence of being prevented from even a kind of trespassing what should have been public property. And this is obviously something that is ongoing. So Luvuyo's project was quite important to us as one of the kind of opening works to the exhibition in Cape Town. This is a pairing that felt quite tactile and exceptional to us because the paintings of Oscar Murillo are, of course, quite known and celebrated. This is from his series Surge, Social Cataracts. But what you see is also the kind of intensities of the paintings, and I'll talk about them briefly later, but I also wanted to just draw attention to the work of Sir Cynthia Mohini Simpson and Isha Ramdas, which inhabits the ground. So one of the things just in terms of sort of curatorial work was, you know, how to create a sort of space where the velocity of the ocean is continuing to destabilize the white cube. And we'll talk a bit more about that. But the kind of, the sort of resistance that liquid archives can bring to an institutional space is something that, you know, we're very interested in. These paintings by Oscar Murillo remind me of lines by the poet Mina Alexander, who wrote about unselving the sea. And in this she wrote in Crossing the Indian Ocean, "When I pulled my head back in, I knew the sea was painted on the inside of my eyelids, that it would never leave me." And I really enjoy this approach of how unforgettable that image is, of it becoming an interior. So in a sense, when I look at these paintings, I often feel that way, that they're so sensorial and tactile that in a sense they become imprinted into your consciousness, in a sense that they also remind you of these undercurrents of history that we referred to before. And they sort of challenge the kind of aesthetics of painting itself, because what Oscar works with, of course, are stitched together canvases. So they defy the sort of unitary space of the canvas. The canvas is already a terrain that is disjointed, that is a space of refusal, but also a space of alliance. One of the references for him in this series has been Monet's water lily pond paintings. And so in a sense, what does that sort of Western imagination of the water lily pond do to the sort of the vast and troubled space of the ocean? How do we think about entrapment but also release within the way that, you know, Oscar is on one hand recollecting art history, but then again refusing to deny its supremacy. In this way, you could also think symbolically about Monet suffering cataracts when he painted the water lilies. So in a sense, the kind of blindness and forced erasure that accompanies him as a subjective artist, but then also about the blinding and the impairment of vision of the colonial enterprise. And this particular segment was noted by my colleague Bonaventure in his reading of the work. The work you see on the ground, so Cynthia Mohini Simpson and Isha Ramdas's installation, is a percussive remembrance resounding in these clay vessels that are called lotas. The lotas are used to fetch water, but the lotas are also used during the process of cremation. So they also, in a sense, are part of the life-death cycle and journey. In this case, they are carriers of coolie mnemonics. And I'm not going to go into detail of what the term coolie means. If you don't know, it would be good that you look it up. Theirs are familial narratives of indentured labor, sugarcane fields, movement and rhythms carried from India to Natal, now KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, and then onward to Australia, where their family traveled. Sugarcane is, in this case, seen only as a remainder in soil, in ash, in salt water, interplaying with broader circuits of shipping and shipped beings amid sensorial rumbles of the plantation or scene. Personal storytelling intersects with lists of items on imperial vessels in a performance that is part of this installation. But what you hear essentially are these rumbles, and you hear the splashing of water, but you never see it. All you see is this installation, the soil, and the mounds, in a sense. So the combination is what was, you know, really created a sort of environment of its own. And I think go to the next, yeah. And then on the other side of that gallery was this work, which brings together again two artists in conversation, Singa Samson and Hasava. Singa Samson is an incredible painter who we were very fortunate to work with and introduced through the team of Zeitz MOCAA. In this particular work, you see it's called Izolo Som Lambo, made in 2019, and it actually also is composed in a way that it shows us this meeting point of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans in the Cape. And so the horizon of the Cape becomes a space that is a point of ceremony, but also of remembrance, at the very center, above the rocky landscape, there is a figure holding a skull. And then you have these various protagonists who are kind of around. And so this kind of approach that Singa navigates is one that performs also a certain youthfulness, but also creates a sort of eternal journey within the terrain of the sea. It creates a space for shared pain, but also mutual recognition. There's always also an assertion of fauna, of the skyline, that disputes the hegemonic gaze, because the protagonists are, in a sense, also creating a meshwork that allows them to be otherwise. The knotting of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans is quite key because it reveals to us in this painting a certain language of fluidity, but also it brings us to some of the spiritual practices that have existed in the Cape that, in Singa's case, also suggest the relationships between ancestors, the relationships between riverbanks and the sea, where ceremonies are held, where ancestors appear. The work that you see in dialogue with it is by artist and poet Hassava, and is called Silent Poets. This again is a work that for us marks these different histories of art making and sensorial exhibition practices in which organic forms are allowed to exist. They're allowed to flourish in a rather clinical space within the white cube. So we basically worked with Hassava on this commission, Silent Poets, where he was sculpting driftwood that was found in and around Cape Town, and these ropes as well were found that they were used actually. So a lot of the work, in a sense, is also materially carrying the history of the usage, and is connecting to fishing communities, is connecting to that very specific coastline. And for Hassava, this is very important because he comes from the Reunion Island, and so in a sense his identity is one of thinking about the many ancestries that run through his own body. And we know that with the Indian Ocean or the Afrasian Sea, the relationship between the islands and the so-called mainland are often quite troubled, and there are certain hierarchies of belonging, of understanding of Africanity, of understanding of Afro-Asianness, which have led to a sort of a space of silencing of certain memories that are shared inherently. And so for Hassava to be in conversation in this way, to suspend these pieces of driftwood that he refers to as well as ancestors, was in a sense also a way of tying together some of these divisions that have been manufactured over time. I don't know how I'm doing for time. Okay.
I think we have like 15.
Okay, yeah, that's more than enough. I also wanted to talk to you about another collaboration that manifested between artist Shiraz Baiju, who is a London-based artist, but is very much thinking through the sort of histories of the Afrasian Sea through another island geography, which is Mauritius. And in this particular work at Zeitz MOCAA, he was in conversation with Tracy Kwai, who is a storyteller and local historian, really, in Kalk Bay, connecting to histories of fishing communities there and Afro-Asian lineage in a very particular part of the bay. These, for Shiraz, are stories that he has been continuing to work on over several years. And what he looks into are modes of resistance and survival within the plantation landscape. The objects that you see here are from museum collections, but also from the artist's own collections as he travels and journeys in the Afrasian Sea. He, on one hand, is thinking about museological models, typically vitrines that dislocate objects from their matrices of relation, and instead creates these wooden sculptures which are far more intimate in terms of how they allow for his practice to circulate across sculpture, across photography, but also bringing in historical museum objects that remind us of the practices of forced movement within this terrain. So some of the examples are from the Botanical Garden in Cape Town, reminding of Dutch colonial past. Others are from with Tracy Kwai, thinking about the relationships between Mauritius and South Africa, particularly in regard to the necessary ways of survival during the time of apartheid by foraging seafood along the shoreline, and the relationships that were made between Creole communities in the Mauritius and enslaved coastal communities in South Africa. Another feature that you see with this quite blurred image at the back, this textile work, is this incredible image from a photograph that Shiraz found in the collection of Kay Brownlee of these queens, and so also thinking about the role of matriarchy, the role of women's stories and their legacies that have again been erased or denied in the more sort of patriarchal heroic chronicles of the Indian Ocean. Oh. In this last segment, I want to draw attention to the work of photographer Akinbode Akinbiyi. He's someone I've been working with in recent years, together with Bonaventure, and also curated a large exhibition of his at the Gropius Bau in Berlin. So first, we'll just look at this particular body of work, which spans several decades. Typically, Akinbode, someone who has a very special way of traveling and inhabiting the African world, especially paying attention to diasporic stories and existence. So this series is made nearly 30 years apart. Lugard's Avenue was made in 2021, and Etequini was made in Durban in 1993. And in these, if you look closely, you will see how the meanings and histories of Asian presences in Uganda and South Africa are marked. They also indicate the spatial demarcations and categorizations of these cities, the informal and formal marketplace and economies that are partly trapped in the colonial enterprise, but also exist fully in their makeup as aftershocks of histories of segregation and displacement. At the same time, you also see syncretism playing out when you look at that image of a temple and a child who's sort of leaning against a window there with an advertisement for Coca-Cola. So how do these sort of formations as well of cosmopolitan and syncretic existence of a certain shared Afro-Asianness exist and play out in these cities? That is what Akinbode has been studying over many, many years. Here in the bottom row, you have a man and his child also by the sea, by engaging in this informal economy, trying to inhabit this shared space of the coast, while again fully acknowledging as well what the various invisible boundaries are, and the kind of economies that must survive within that landscape. When looking at these, one also needs to think about how pidginization is not only a language but is also a cultural formation that travels in the littoral. So you see in the city as well advertisements for various cuisines that bring together the Afrasian desire for food, but also for clothing, for saris, for sukas, for gomeses. And so this is a form of perhaps evidence of how these multiple cultures have existed alongside each other for so long. Similarly, there are photographs of street names and other such signs that take us maybe far from the coast, but still show us what is shared between these places. Another series by Akinbode is called Sea Never Dry, and that again is a series that he has been making since the 1980s, and it's ongoing. And this particular series brings together geographies that extend from Dakar to Lagos to Europe, to also think about the ways in which visual culture around the beach also differs radically, and how these forms of conviviality and access play out. I think of them as monochromatic watermarks as they conspire in drawing us toward water as a domain that acts both as a centrifugal but also a centripetal force, allowing for a moving center. And so even the way that these compositions have been made, there's a kind of a kinetic approach to these photographs. They never seem to stand still. They have a certain kind of way in which there's a tilt, there's a diagonal line, there is a sense of motion that is implied. And so while they acknowledge the role of water as a field of circulation, they also think about what it swallows, spits out, and remembers. A text that was commissioned as a response to this series by poet and author Aishan Hutchinson goes, I quote, "And more significantly, the sea is repeated in the body's intentness on elsewhere. Even when a figure stands still, he or she appears wave-like. There is always a slight tilt, a fugitive gesture breaking straight lines. We see a hand raised or another motioning. Here a head turns aslant, there another bows, acknowledging something outside our view." What does oceanic rememory look like, and how to correspond and commemorate this terrain that is equally one of connection as it is of alienation, ruinations, and trauma? There are multi-directional historiographies to draw from, to recover, embodied, desiring, and sensorially anchored, as we have talked about today. Artistic modes activate oceanic processes of self and collective recovery, histories of return of knowledge, water as the first and last source of healing. When Christina Sharp writes about the wake in relation to family, she asks, I quote, "Attune not to our individual circumstances, but also to those circumstances as they were an indication of and related to the larger anti-Black world that structures all of our lives." Wake as in the state of wakefulness, consciousness, and in the wake of the unfinished project of emancipation. We need to build shared perspectives around these continuous oceans, a term I take from Renée Samavani, because it is a way to revive a critical form of globalism of diasporas and deep-seated belonging that is located beyond the time scale of imperialism. Through this, we may refuse the ascent of nationalisms on a planetary scale. And in this effort, we dwell in acculturations absorbed via monsoon cycles, economies of interdependence, communitarian kinship, sacred practices that lie in the waters, and early cosmopolitanism that was premised on difference while still bearing the intimacy of recognition and co-creation. Thank you. I now invite Hiba to take over, give us a sonic feast. showing of different artistic practices, voices, to kind of also have this dense mix, to think about also this multi-linguistic sonic refractions and continuities. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
We have only 10 minutes, I've been told.
Oh, okay. So maybe just a question,
and
then we'll turn it over to the
up,
audience.
So, yeah.
There's so much I'd love to unpack longer. I guess we'll start off with thinking about the idea of the Afrasian Sea, and that there's many languages, traditions, and religions that exist historically and contemporarily. And so in your work, working across Sri Lanka, South Africa, and Berlin as well, how do you locate language flows, local contexts, sonic imprints, and oral traditions within your work?
Okay, great. That's like a 3-in-1 kind of question.
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to also mention, this addressing of the naming of the Indian Ocean as something we've been particularly attentive to, because obviously calling it the Indian Ocean is again a rather fatal move, because it separates us from the coast in Australia, the African world, and is in that sense quite flawed. And this is also why people like, for instance, Yvonne Adiyambo-Owour's novelist and scholar, has in her work constantly attempted to build a lexicon around the question of naming these waters, and reminding as well what kind of names echo back and forwards as we change vantage points in these waters. So with that sort of shift in vantage points, orality is a big one, and we've talked about that, which is also why these fields of listening are perhaps the only way to truly recompose archives of this ocean, because many things are kind of traversing as knowledge that is embodied. Things are remembered and spoken at certain kind of occasions, whether that is a ceremony, whether that is a certain kind of occasion where there is a gathering around food, and we also know that Malagization, Creolitude, and also like coolitude, these are all like terms that have been asserting the polyphonous ways in which language is expressed in these waters, and you also see this, like I was thinking as well, even when one lands in a certain place, be that in Sharjah, for example, or other spaces. Also, when I had the occasion to meet Atia Khan in Cape Town, we had this exchange as well around lost and found languages. When you land at the Sharjah airport, you hear so many languages, and you know that these languages have been spoken for centuries in the waters. We just have lost that ability and gotten very stuck in a singularity of language that is diminishing us. So yeah, I think we need to sort of conjure that sense of awareness, and it seems to be happening with the kind of artistic modes that are playing out.
Thank you. Yes. So let's turn over to the audience. Let's turn it over to the audience. Yep. Let's do that.
So I have one. It's the solo one. Maybe my voice could be here or here. I was struck by your practice as a curator, the way that you kind of centralize discourse and allow for a lot of conversation between practices, and the way that you showed images largely was these kind of aggregated spaces where the identity of individual artists is lost. And I think in doing so, the kind of heat or weight of what's between their practices kind of ended up being what was shown. But we live in this world that's very professionalist, and in many ways is about the visibility of the identity of the artist, or the kind of singularity of that voice. The majority of the work that you showed was collaborative or something between two artists. So I imagine that's intentional. But how do you reckon with this kind of reality that we have to be professionalist and to kind of have the work kind of speak to a singular identity of an art practice?
Yeah. I think it also helps to be sort of conscious of the ways in which artists often, end up working, and also being the organizers around the informal parts of the art world, and these are not peripheries, these are our centers. I mean, I think we don't need the kind of conditions of pandemic to alert us towards why art making flourishes in collectivity and in community. I mean, this is something that is just true, and it's been apparent to many of us. And I think for me, it's just been a way of realizing a practice that is embedded very fully in larger sort of models like biennials and so forth, but equally in smaller artist-led or sort of other kinds of independent formations. And when these move side by side, you sort of don't lose sight of the what's at stake and why you do what you do. And I've also, I guess, been lucky to work with artists who have this kind of intrinsic generosity that through which they want to pass on the invitation, So even when we worked with Akinbode Akinbiyi, whose photographs I've shown you, it was a major solo exhibition, and that was very vital because he's been a figure who has been mentoring so many artists across the world, and has curated things like the Bamako Biennial of photography. So this solo moment was essential, and there was a community around it. So it was a solo moment to celebrate his life work, but at the same time, within that exhibition, there was a short film that was made about him by another photographer, Kalameka Okereke. And so, this connection was another way to pass on the invitation. And so I think even in solo exhibits, that's just an example, you can do this, you can program differently, publish differently, and that's just something that I mean, I don't know any other way. It would be extremely boring to do it any other way, I think, so, yeah.
Yeah, my question starts at the same place that Brian's did. You took it a little bit different direction than I thought maybe you were going with it, which is perfect, because maybe I can follow up with the second piece, which is about kind of a meta question about your practice, but also the way you presented the practice in this lovely talk tonight, which felt very kind of embedded and situated both in theoretical ideas and your own commitment to making a theoretical contribution, it seems, and then also being embedded in this very close attention to artwork. Some of your descriptions of the artworks, I'm in the art history department, were like very kind of art historical almost, or analytical in their like attention to the specificity of the works. And so one question I had for you in terms of your practice is if you see yourself as kind of a point of connection or interconnection as someone who's either teaching your work, or you want the curatorial and sort of writing piece of it as well, sort of be facing scholarly theoretical publics as well as artistic publics and community active, various publics, and just kind of how you think about your own both positionality, I guess, between scholarship and the art world or art making, art curatorial practice, and then which publics you're kind of wanting to be in conversation with, which I imagine is many, but I just would like to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's, I realize that the kinds of exhibitions that I'm engaged with and are perhaps unsettling certain kind of expectations, especially in the museum world. I think biennials are way more propositional, and they allow for publishing and programming, as strong threads that are not sort of afterthoughts in the best case scenario. Sometimes they are, but for me, they and my collaborators, they move in a simultaneous fashion. So while being in conversation with artists and doing like a 2-hour studio visit, I might on the same day sort of reach out to a poet or a scholar and reflect, and I just simply don't see these things as separate. I think they become part of the language of the exhibition, and of course there are we need to kind of find ways to liaise and mediate them for audiences that may find certain entry points more difficult and need to have a more easy entry into into a work. But I often feel like there are various maybe layers of texts and intertextuality. So it's not, you may go into the exhibition and you may find an excerpt of a poem, and you might find like the majority of the space is this kind of unfolding of artistic modes and propositions. And I mean we're also not creating the kind of like dry exhibitions, hopefully, that make you feel like you're basically just moving through a book in space. I think the trick is also to always kind of carry the artist with you, also to not presume that the artist is not interested in the sort of other disciplines that you sort of carry with you in your research, or one is sort of lucky to be in correspondence with such artists, I would say. And then the move towards publicness is negotiated at many stations in the process. It's not publicness only when an exhibition opens, right? So I think that also maybe allows for us to do what we need to do, and also not treat the opening day as the only point in which a public can enter the process.
Thank you so much for being here, and all you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.